My family history is marked by one of the greatest migrations in human history. What happened when the map of India was drawn in 1947 is so extreme to be almost mythical. And if it were fiction, one might have accused the writer of hyperbole. Two countries, India and Pakistan, came into being abruptly and arbitrarily. Their borders were created by a cartographer who was given 40 days to redraw the map of a continent he had never visited. And 15 million people crossed a border within a matter of weeks. And in that crossing, they say between 1 and 3 million people died. Those of you who have read about the partition of the subcontinent know that people who had been neighbors for generations suddenly committed acts of unimaginable cruelty towards one another. They murdered families they had lived beside. They raped one another's daughters. They set entire villages aflame. There are stories of trains of refugees arriving on the other side of the border with only corpses inside. So what does this sorry episode of history teach us? Does it teach us that there must have been sectarian strife lurking beneath the surface all those years, a kind of sinister hatred threading through the usual business of neighborly friendship? Or does it tell us that this is what happens when one says to an entire population, your religion unites you and divides you? Here is a border that dictates who is your ally and who is your enemy. You can suddenly rewrite the entire span of your history according to this new map, and as you do this, as you go back in time and paint your friend in the color of your enemy, you give yourself license to take away everything: his home, his family, even his life. My grandparents were born in colonial India and witnessed the birth of India and Pakistan. They lived in Calcutta during the terrible riots that preceded partition. My uncle, my father's older brother, spent his youth tortured by terrible nightmares of the violence he had witnessed as a child. After partition, my grandparents moved across the border to begin their lives as citizens of Pakistan. My parents were born in Pakistan, but as they grew up, it became apparent that for them, Bengali Muslims, a state based on religious unity couldn't encompass the duality of their identities. So that they and many of their generation began to envision the possibility of a nation that could enshrine the complexity of who they were. And they also believed that they were fighting for a number of other higher ideals like democracy, pluralism, and religious tolerance, because they had basically grown up in dictatorship. So in December 1971, that possibility became a reality, and the nation of Bangladesh came into being, and that was the nation into which I was born 4 years later. Growing up, many of the difficulties and misunderstandings I had with my parents were not just generational, but stemmed from the fact that while they were raised in the struggle for a nation, I had the luxury of being born into one. And the fight for freedom was solidly in the past. My country has given me that thing which is foundational: a place to call home, a place to long for, a place from which to retreat, a place to love, a place to sometimes hate or be ashamed of. It's been a fixed point on the map that holds steady through all the vagaries of my very itinerant life, which you heard a little bit about. The physical borders of that country help me to define who I am. They create the imaginary binaries on which so much of my identity is based: myself, my others, my people, my tribe, not my tribe. But having relied on and loved and been defined by borders my whole life, I would hereby officially like to renounce them forever. I propose to you that we no longer allow our maps to tell us the outline of what is mine and what is yours, what is here and what is there. Because although they have in the past been created to give something to people like my parents, to give them citizenship, autonomy, self-determination, rights, they are now little more than places of rupture, places where we work out the worst instincts, our worst instincts: insularity, selfishness, greed. Where perhaps in the past, national freedom and the borders they demanded were the symbols of emancipation from colonial rule, they have become little more than the manifestation of our fear of others. We build walls and checkpoints. We create elaborate rules by which we let certain people in and keep certain people out. Worst of all, we buy the narrative that without such borders, our ability to self-organize, to sustain prosperity, is at risk. But this is a fallacy. Borders allow us to fall back on our human desire to exclude. So what I propose to you is a reframing of our priorities along the lines of what is moral, not on the lines of what is convenient. I believe that our age, and the particular challenges of our age, demand such reframing. In the midst of wars that destroy cities and make entire populations homeless, of mass migrations that force people to throw themselves into the ocean with the hope they may cross over to the other side of a border, of random acts of evil that turn concert halls into grave sites, what is demanded of us is not just grief or anger. What is demanded of us is radical transformation, the kind that occurred when we went from tribes to nations in the first place. Those of us like myself who were born after these nations came into being, and often in the shadow of this great societal upheaval, are somehow under the impression that all the change and all the major shifts were the jobs of people who lived many years ago, many generations ago. Believing ourselves to be living in a post-historical age, we no longer imagine that it is in our remit to effect radical change. And yet such belief is not just lazy, it is deeply damaging. For if our imaginations continue to fail us, we will be forever marked by the smallness of our ambitions. We will be remembered as a species that chose our basest instincts over our higher ones. In 50 or 100 years, this question will be academic, because climate change will force us to rethink our borders. The rising seas will wipe out our insularity and isolationism in one fell swoop.